Welcome back. In an effort to decriminalize marijuana, President Joe Biden pardoned any American convicted on prior federal charges of simple marijuana possession. For decades, activists have fought to decriminalize the recreational use of marijuana, while these charges negatively affected thousands of Americans. Director of Drug Markets and Legal Regulation at the Drug Policy Alliance, Kat Packer, joined me to discuss the impact this will have on our country. Kat, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, can you discuss the long time effort from many advocates across the country to decriminalize marijuana?
Yes, advocates have been working for decades to decriminalize cannabis here in the United States. Uh, Cannabis has been illegal here in the United States since 1937 with the Marijuana Tax Act. But starting with California, folks began to try to decriminalize cannabis, essentially removing penalties for cannabis-related activity. And that could include possession, but also increasingly is including other types of cannabis activity to include sales as well.
Now, can you talk a little bit about the history of cannabis and its relationship with mass incarceration?
Absolutely. I think that we have to continuously talk about the relationship between cannabis prohibition and mass incarceration. There was an author, Michelle Alexander, who in her book, The New Jim Crow, articulated the relationship as this. She said that nothing has contributed more to the systematic mass incarceration of people of color in the United States than the war on drugs. And through research and data that's been collected by advocates and the FBI at this point, it's very clear that most of all drug arrests have been for cannabis. And about 80% of cannabis arrests have been for things like simple possession. And this has really allowed the US prison system to balloon over the course of the last several decades. And if you look at the arrest statistics and the conviction statistics, you'll see that overwhelmingly the folks who were impacted by these laws were Black and Brown communities.
Now, you mentioned the war on drugs, and we're talking about just mass incarceration in regards to marijuana. Can you just talk about the impact this had on Black and Brown people from low income communities? How did this affect children? How did this affect their families? Stuff like that.
Absolutely. So even a arrest or conviction for simple marijuana possession could mean that folks' entire lives were disrupted. Folks with cannabis arrests and convictions could be subject to discrimination in housing, employment, education, the very things that we strive for in society. And one of the most harmful aspects is that communities were displaced. I mean, we are literally putting folks in cages for their engagement with cannabis-related activities, and it's had extremely adverse impacts on individuals personally and on their families and communities collectively. Not to mention that for youth in particular, it meant denied access to opportunities and could very well be the thing that prevented them from moving forward with different opportunities in life.
I'm really glad that you talked about that because we tend to focus these conversations on just the adults. But as we know, like what we're seeing now with vaping and, all of that stuff that teenagers, have partaken, drug use just in general. And I wonder like if they were met with, a learning lesson or, met as a health issue as opposed to, strictly just sending them off to prison or to jail. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that and, how it affected them later on in life. Now, I think it's really important to note that this is only for simple possession of marijuana. First, can you just explain what the Biden administration means by that? And, what is considered a simple possession?
Absolutely. So part of the Biden announcement recently articulated uh, that there was going to be a pardoning for individuals with federal convictions for simple cannabis possession. And what we know thus far is that there are about 6,500 individuals who may be eligible, in addition to some what we expect to be a few thousand individuals in DC, because the federal government enforces DC's cannabis laws. When we're talking about simple possession, we're literally talking about possession of a specific threshold for cannabis. Under the Controlled Substances Act, individuals can be charged with simple possession if they possess 50 kilograms or less of cannabis. Anything in excess of that would be considered trafficking. But it's also important to note that the line that's drawn both at the federal level and the state level between cannabis users and cannabis sellers is very blurry. And you could have individuals who sold either small amounts of cannabis, or even, for example, taking cannabis and putting it into a plastic bag could be considered manufacturing, can be considered cannabis manufacturing, such that that is no longer a simple possession charge, but could be considered cannabis trafficking. And so I think that there is an increasing need not only to address individuals who have these federal simple possession charges, but to review all of cannabis charges. And that's particularly important because President Biden, in his rationale for articulating why he thought that we shouldn't continue this failure, as he articulated it, is because there are many states where this activity is legal. Well, the reality is that there are an increasing number of states where what would previously have been considered trafficking is legal. And not only is it legal, but it is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And so we should not continue to have folks hemmed up for these charges when folks are making profit all around the country.
I'm so glad that you actually brought that up, because I wanted to talk about that. I've noticed just in the past few years, the cannabis industry, as you mentioned, is worth millions and millions of dollars. Should there just be an extreme or an extra effort to help those, people who sold marijuana, because it's all over like our media. It's almost glorified in a way. And so it is strange to see that there are still some people who are still in the shadows in regards to this.
Yeah, it's a tale of two cities. We have America where folks are living in completely different realities. And the reality is largely, if you are a white individual, cannabis has largely been legal for these communities, and that it's not been these communities who have been targeted. Now, part of what President Biden acknowledged is that use amongst white and Black communities is the same, but the arrests were disproportionately targeted to Black and Brown communities. And that's not just the case for simple possession. That is the case when we look at cannabis, what's considered trafficking at the federal level. And so we want to make sure that we are advocating that no one get left behind. The entirety of cannabis prohibition and criminalization has been a failure, not just individuals with past cannabis convictions. And the other piece of this too is that it does not, his pardon does not address folks who would be charged with simple possession in the future. It is a one-time clemency pardon provided to these individuals, but it does not stop folks in the future from being charged with the exact same penalty that we've now acknowledged as a failure.
Wow, thank you so much for clarifying that, because those are the little details that I think sometimes get lost. Now, I know the Department of Justice is working to devise a process for those covered by Biden's pardon to receive a certificate of pardon. Will this be helpful in regard to those looking for employment, housing, etc.? Just because we know that those things on your record can affect whether or not you get a job or housing. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So this is where this particular announcement and the pardon will have the greatest benefit, and that these 6,500 plus individuals have up until this point continued to be potentially denied opportunities for housing, education, and employment. And with this pardon, they should be able to have those particular liberties, those civil liberties restored, and be able to participate in society in ways that they may have been previously denied. However, it's also important to articulate that this pardon does not erase their criminal, the criminal record or conviction. It essentially would appear on the individual's record alongside the original conviction. And this is part of the reason why advocates are saying that it's not enough just to pardon these individuals, but that individuals actually should have the records cleared entirely for that particular simple possession offense.
So we have just a little bit of time left, but I really want to touch on this. Do you think there should be an effort, or will there be an effort to offer transition or just support to people, who are coming from a very hostile environment to essentially normal society? Because I know that a lot of people talk about, what happens inside prisons and jails is just really traumatic. So will there be any effort to address that?
I think that there absolutely should be. And that's why I think that the president's announcement really is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of acknowledging the harms that communities have experienced and identifying those communities that have experienced that harm. I think that because we know who these individuals are, we should be making an effort to identify specifically how their past criminal conviction for simple possession has impacted them, and make sure that they have equitable access to programming that would support them, particularly in those areas that we know that they were denied access to opportunities like housing, like education, like employment. That has to be a part of how we move this conversation forward. It would be completely harmful if we move forward with commercialization and do not address the continued criminalization, the continued collateral consequences that individuals face. And now that we know who these individuals are, I think we need to be prepared to have them restored, made whole, because that's the type of disruption that cannabis prohibition allows.
Now, can you just let everybody know how they can stay up to date with your organization?
Absolutely. You can find us at drugpolicy.org or at drugpolicy on Twitter.
All right, Kat, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.